Welcome to the Chess Angle. In this episode, I'm going to be discussing the thought process when it's your turn to move. First, just some housekeeping. I'm recording this a little bit of a plug and play thing today. I'm kind of between equipment. The reason I mention that, the sound quality may not be as good as some of my previous episodes, and I apologize for that. I'm doing a bit of a plug and play on this one. I'm just doing a USB mic directly into the computer, but I'm sure with some post-processing, it'll come out just fine. But I'm kind of between equipment right now. That's what I wanted to let you know. And the reason I mention this, when I first started the podcast, I'm going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, but I think it's an interesting conversation about the podcast in general. Basically, there were two concerns I had. The first one was I going to like it? It was an idea I had, and, you know, as with many others, little cliche, I was kind of pushed into actually doing it from the pandemic and the quarantine. I had been kicking it around for a while. Is it another thing I want on my plate? And then the pandemic kind of pushed me to actually pursue it. But I was concerned that, you know, I wouldn't like it. Am I going to continue doing it? So I didn't want to rush out and, you know, buy all this equipment. And, you know, you read about people who do that. They start a podcast and they spend all this money because they want to get this top stuff. And then for whatever reason, they don't continue. And now they're stuck with all this equipment. So basically for me, I'm a music teacher by day, a musician. I kind of had the equipment lying around. So I just started doing it the previous episodes on my Shure SM58. Any musician knows that mic. Thing's a workhorse. It'll outlive most people. So I started doing it on that with the equipment I had, you know, in a basic interface. And, you know, it was decent equipment. I think the quality of the previous episodes is pretty good. But now that I like it, you know, in other words, the first thing I was concerned about, what I like doing it, I do like doing it. I really like the podcast a lot. I'm looking to upgrade my equipment. I recently had a birthday, got some gift cards, so I'm putting them towards that. But of course, I broke down what I was using, and I'm still in the middle of setting up the new stuff. So I wanted to get this episode out, you know, because I'm releasing bi-weekly on Sundays, and I didn't want to miss that schedule. So I said, let me just do a plug and play into the computer. So the point is, if it's not quite up to the quality of the other ones, I apologize, but I'm sure it'll be fine. Like I said, I'll treat it in post. Because what happens also, the reason I'm mentioning this with a lot of podcasts, there's something called pod fading or pod fade. I recently learned this term. That's basically when someone decides to start a podcast, they record a few episodes and then they just kind of stop because they realize the amount of work, or they just don't want to do it, or they don't like it. That's something I was worried about. And they say most podcasts, when they start, don't get past 7 episodes. And we're already on episode, this is 15. Yep. So we're doing real well. And I like it. So I do like it. I'm going to continue. So I've decided, you know, it's time to maybe upgrade my equipment a little bit. I just didn't want to run out and do it immediately like some people. And I used what I had, which made sense. And the second thing I was concerned with is, you know, will people listen? Is this going to kind of take off? Am I going to get some numbers? Not that that was my main concern. This was more of a passion project. But I said, if I'm doing this 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months and like 3 people are listening, well, that's, you know, that's tough to find motivation. But that hasn't happened. You know, people like it. They like discussing the game. They like discussing the game at the amateur level. And I'm very grateful for that and all of you who are listening. So the point of this little interlude, which I realize has nothing to do with chess. So for those of you who are still listening to this episode, basically I'm between equipment right now. And my goal is for the next episode in a couple weeks that I'll have my full setup. So just a little bit about my background with the podcast. And let's go to chess now. So what I'd like to do is discuss the thought process when it's your turn to move. And this is not just for beginners. I was going to label it that way. Like I was thinking of having some of the episodes in the podcast exclusively for beginners. I was going to call it, I don't know if I was going to call it Beginner's Corner. That's a little cliche, maybe something a little hipper than that. But I was thinking of doing some episodes specifically for beginners or beginning tournament players. And I was going to label this as such, but then I realized players of all levels, myself included, who's been playing a long time, need a reminder of the thought process before we move. Strong players, titled players mess this up all the time. So even though, yes, technically, if you want to be literal about it, this is probably geared for more intermediate and beginning players or people approaching the intermediate level and lower. But the truth is, regardless of your level, I think there's something you can take away from this. And it's a reminder for myself as well. So I'm going to be discussing the thought process really for amateur games and the amateur level and amateur time controls. Because the reason is at the highest levels where they're playing in these major tournaments, there are really long time controls, but most of us are playing at the club level where it might be a game 60 or a game 90, meaning 60 minutes per player or 90 minutes per player. So the thought process is a little different. You really can't take 15 minutes on a move at the club level. I mean, you could theoretically, but then you're going to have clock issues and get into time pressure. So I want to make this very practical and know also that nothing here is anything I'm making up. Pretty much everything I'm saying has been stated by others, but I'm kind of just taking a different approach to it, and I'm going to go down some different paths as I discuss it. So the first thing you need to think about when it's your turn to move, you have to ask yourself, what is the threat? So it's your turn to move, meaning your opponent just moved. And this is probably the biggest mistake that players make at all levels. You simply don't factor in your opponent's plans, or at least not as much as you should. This is neglected at all levels. And when I say your opponent's plans, I'm not talking about just immediate tactics. You need to look at the long-term plans of your opponent, and you need to stop those plans, be aware of them. Now, sometimes you can't. You can't stop everything. I studied with the late international master Danny Kopeck for about a year or so, and he had a great saying. He used to say, you can't stop everything. You can't always stop everything, but you have to be aware of your opponent's plans before you even look at your own. I mean, that's important. And, you also have to, again, not just look at tactics, but long-term plans, because maybe you can prevent those. And another common thing, very practical thing that people miss, is when a defensive move is also a threat. So what I mean by that, you made a move and your opponent just defended it, but you have to look that defensive move isn't also a threat. So for example, you make a move, he moves his queen to defend, but now his queen is also attacking something. It's easy to miss those dual purpose moves. So that's something to be aware of. And another specific thing is when your opponent plays a bizarre opening or an unconventional opening, that's where you really need to take your time and not look to punish the opponent. This is something that I've struggled with. Maybe it's this need to prove yourself or it's an ego thing, but often when your opponent plays a bizarre opening or violates a common quote unquote opening principle, you think, oh, I gotta punish him, right? You start rubbing your hands together. I'm going to punish him. It's going to be a quick win. That's not true. Even though the opening principles might have been violated, it doesn't mean it's going to be a quick win. And the idea isn't to punish your opponent, but just to try to take advantage of that as best you can. But again, when they play a strange opening, you got to be careful you don't fall into the trap of just responding like you normally would. You really need to see what's happening and think it through and not rush. Now, here's a little bit of an example. If you play D4 as white, let's say you have the white piece and you play D4, a common theoretical idea is at some point for black to play C5 to hit at the center. But black will often play knight C6 first, which according to the books, technically that's not a good move because you're blocking the C pawn. But you might see your opponent block the C pawn and think, oh, it's a one game for me now. That's a dangerous mindset to get into. Yes, positionally, it might be a mistake, but there's a lot of chess left in the game, and you don't want to just start punishing your opponent, quote unquote, and then making your position worse. So that's something to think about. But ultimately, the first thing you need to think of is, what is the threat? What are your opponent's plans? What is he trying to do? You need to understand that because he or she just moved. So assuming that's dealt with, or assuming there's no immediate threat, maybe it's just a normal developing move. Once that's taken care of, okay, you've determined whether or not there's a threat. If there's no immediate threat, then you look at tactical ideas. Tactics, for those of you who are beginners, basically short-range moves that can win material. And of course, always look for checkmating ideas. The name of the game is checkmate, so you need to always be aware of that. Look at your opponent's king, see if it's vulnerable, always be aware of that. And this section on tactics also includes combinations. Those are longer sequences of moves. A combination might be a 3, 4, 5, or 6 move sequence, something like that, or longer, that can win material or lead to mate. But of course, I'm including all of these ideas, checkmate and combinations and anything that can win material or win the game. I'm including this under the tactical part of the thought process before you move. Okay. If you win more than a pawn, it's generally decisive. Most of you know that. If you win a pawn, that's not always decisive because a lot can happen. But I mean, if you win a rook or a knight or a bishop, something like that, it's usually decisive. The other person will probably resign at that point. Not always, but you need to look if you can win material. Are there any tactical moves where I can win something? But always be careful of dangerous pawn grabs or so-called hot pawns. Yasser Seirawan was known for that. What I mean by hot pawns is very often your queen can capture a pawn deep in your opponent's territory sometimes, but then you got to be careful because it's like, yay, I won a pawn, but then your opponent will quietly develop his pieces while attacking your queen, and then he gets a lead in development, which is usually more than enough compensation for the lost pawns. You got to be careful, and you have to be careful that your queen or whatever piece takes that pawn doesn't get trapped. That can happen with knights very often, where a knight is deep in your opponent's territory early in the game, and then there's no escape squares. So you have to watch pieces getting trapped. So you have to kind of weigh that. Some players really enjoy grabbing those hot pawns and kind of dealing with that. It's almost like, they enjoy that. It's like a thrill for them. I generally will not do that if I think my opponent's going to get a little bit more of an initiative. So you have to weigh that. You have to weigh the pros and cons. Is winning the pawn worth it compared to how my opponent can respond and maybe get a lead in development? So that's something to think about. So you don't want to grab pawns or any other material thoughtlessly. But at any rate, the second thing is, after you determine threats, you need to look at tactical shots that you can play. Now, assuming there are no tactics, which will probably be true for most positions, you then need to look at positional ideas or planning. And this is probably where most of your moves are going to be, focused on. Really positional ideas and planning, because there's not always going to be a threat. There's not always going to be a tactical shot. So now you got to think long term. Most positions are not going to involve an immediate tactical shot. I just want to make that clear. Now, there's a lot to talk about with this. Now, some of it has been established. Some of it is my own opinion, but I'm just going to share this with you. Now, you need to look at long-term plans here. Jeremy Silman, who I've mentioned, international master, he talks about the imbalances, but these are things that most chess players think about. Things like space, initiative, your minor pieces, making your bishops and knights better than your opponents, looking at weak squares and files, looking at king safety, things like that. And of course, you have to look at your plans and your opponent's plans. You have to know when to be defensive as well. One of the hallmarks of, quote unquote, bad players is that they don't think defensively. Everything is just what they want to do, and they just completely ignore their opponent's plans, or they don't pay attention to them enough adequately. All right, so you need to look at your ideas and your opponent's ideas. Can you improve the position of your pieces? Are you controlling a square? Or, can you get your rook on an open file to control a file? Is there a weak pawn you can attack? Things of that nature. Can you create a weak pawn? Can you open up a file? These are all different things to think about. I mean, you could do a whole episode just on the middle game and that type of planning, but just some general ideas, because I don't want this to get too like thorny and complicated. So a few things. Now, if it's a very closed position, meaning there's not a lot of open files and it's very dense, there's a lot of pieces on the board, then you can look at slow maneuvering because you can take your time. It's not like there's all these dynamic, crazy tactics going on. So closed positions is usually slow maneuvering, maybe trying to crack open a file. If it's an open position, then you look for more, tactical things, opening up lines for your pieces, more attacking. Again, I'm kind of oversimplifying a little bit, but just something to think about. Now, if you're stuck, okay, meaning you have no idea what to do. This often happens when there's a lot of pieces on the board where you get stuck, like I'm not sure what I should do. Just think about basic ideas that you can handle without a lot of deep thought. In other words, can you stop counterplay? Like, what is your opponent trying to do? Can you prevent that? Can you prevent his piece from going on a square? Centralize your rooks. Look to improve the position of your pieces. Things of that nature. Okay. Now, a couple of things with this. You may have heard about, the idea of the two bishops. Like, a lot of people think that two bishops are somehow better than a bishop and a knight or two knights. I really question that, especially at the amateur level. Okay. Because yes, I get it. If it's an open position, the bishops can be more valuable, but I think that is sort of overdone because even in open positions, if your knight gets on a really good outpost, it can often be better than the bishop. So I guess the best way I can explain it, a lot of people think that they have like a decisive advantage because they have the two bishops and the opponent has, let's say, only one bishop or no bishops. That's not true. It depends on whose pieces are better. All right, because I think that whole, but I have the two bishops, I just think that's an overrated concern, especially at the amateur level. So just to put a kind of a cap on this, for the positional ideas and for your planning, right? So you looked at threats, you looked at tactics. Basically, look at your opponent's plans, your plans, and come up with moves that fulfill that plan, basically, rather than just aimlessly developing or just moving a piece just to move it. You should have some idea in mind. Now, it's not like every move has to have this amazing idea behind it, but you should have at least some justification for why you're playing it. Okay. And if you're stuck, well, I know what I do. If I'm really not sure what to do, I have no idea because there's so much going on. Try to stop your opponent's ideas. Stop counterplay, take away squares, try to activate your rooks, try to improve the position of your pieces. Okay. And then the very last part of this, which is the most important thing, is to do a blunder check. So you've gone through this whole process, and now you need to say, okay, is my intended move a mistake? I looked at everything and it seems like a good move, but what does my opponent have? Does he have any checks? Does he have any other in-between moves like an intermezzo? Does he have any captures, exchanges? You almost have to be cynical about your move choice. That's something else that Danny Kopak had told me when I was studying with him. When it's your turn to move, you almost have to be like cynical. Like you have to like poke holes in your move. And very often you'll go through this thought process, but then you'll realize it's a mistake. So now, when I say do a blunder check, meaning make sure you're not making a mistake, make sure it's not flawed tactically. The most common mistake that we all make is that we'll have a move in mind based on a positional idea. For example, if I play this move, I'm going to have more control over this square, or I'm going to crack open a file, or if I make this move, I'm going to defend this piece. You see the positional value of it, but then you realize or you don't realize that it fails tactically. For example, if I make this move, I'm going to control this square more. Oh, but wait a minute, he can then win my knight. Or I'm going to make this move that attacks his knight. Oh, but wait a minute, when he moves his knight, he's then going to fork my rooks. Something like that. You have to always check it tactically, and you also have to analyze far enough. You don't need to look 6, 7, 8 moves deep. I don't think most of us could do that, but you have to look more than just a move or two ahead. You can't just say, okay, well, if I do this, he can do this. You often have to go a little bit further. You have to analyze far enough. That's one of the main differences between stronger players and weaker players. It's not so much the amount of theory that they have, but they analyze better. Now, one thing to prevent blunders that people recommend is to write the move down first before you make it on the score sheet. The idea is there's something just about the tactile and physical experience of writing it down and looking at it and then looking at the board that you might correct yourself. I'm not so sure how effective that is, just my opinion. If it works for you, do it. I know for me, I'm a little biased. I just want to be honest because I keep score electronically. And when you keep score electronically, you obviously can't record it on the electronic scorekeeper first before moving because the electronic scorekeeper has another board. With electronic scorekeeping, you actually have a board where you can manually move the pieces. So if I do that before moving, I can actually see the position. So that's basically cheating. You can't do that. So as someone who uses an electronic score sheet, I have to make my move first. So I'm just used to that. But even when I was keeping score by hand with pencil and paper, I don't know that it really helped me that much. Just my opinion. But some people swear by it. Some people write their move down first. You need to do what works for you. Because again, everything in this podcast, it's not like you should definitely do this. I mean, once in a while I might say that, but you have to do what works for you. And for some people, writing the move down first may help. For me, I'm not sure that it helped that much, but something to think about. The other thing with the blunder check, and this is, when it's your turn to move in general, you have to look at exchange sequences carefully. In other words, every time you go to trade a piece, you have to look at the position when everything comes out in the wash. That's very important. A lot of mistakes are made that way. Bad exchanges. You really got to look at those carefully to see what happens, because you might think, all right, I'll trade my knight for his knight. It's an even exchange. As far as point count, yes, but you got to look at the resulting position afterwards. That's something that we often forget to do. Trading queens is a huge one. Okay, trading queens, because essentially, once you trade queens, you're pretty much in the end game, and the resulting position can often be decisive for one side or the other. So trading queens, you need to think about carefully. I had this just the other night where I messed this up. Okay, if a student I was teaching, like an adult beginner, showed me this position, I would have said, oh, I don't know why you did that. And yet I did it myself because, we all do it. It happens at all levels. And it was a little behind out of the opening, but I handled it very well. And then it got to an end game, and he ended up blundering a pawn. I was back into the game. I was really happy. And then the end game, we were both in a little bit of time pressure. It was at least a draw. Maybe a win for me, I'm not sure, but it was at least a draw easily. And I should not have traded queens. Okay, he was threatening me, and I should have just moved my bishop back to protect. I traded queens because I thought I could get a passed pawn and my king would be better. I miscalculated and ended up losing the game that should have at least been drawn. What I should have done, if I felt I was slightly better, you generally want to keep the queens on. He had less time than me. It was just a bad decision. I knew, thematically I should have kept the queens on, but I messed up the analysis that I thought I could get this passed pawn, because obviously knowing when to convert into a winning ending is part of the game, but I miscalculated, and ultimately it was a bad exchange sequence. So you really have to look at exchanges. And speaking of the end game, knowing when to transpose into a winning king and pawn ending is crucial, because that decision often is decisive. In other words, when I say king and pawn ending, just for those of you who may be new to the game, meaning when you trade all your pieces, so the only pieces left on the board are kings, each player's king and pawns. That's it. There are no other pieces. And often what determines the winner at that point is king position and who can get a passed pawn first. But knowing when to trade into that is often decisive. In other words, when you decide to go into a king and pawn ending, sometimes it's drawn, but very often one player has a clear advantage. So you got to be careful. You have to know whether it's drawn or whether it's decisive, but that can often be a blunder. I've won many games where my opponent would trade down into a king and pawn endgame, and I would win just because after the trade, it was completely winning. My king was much better, and they didn't realize that. That's a common mistake at the amateur level where people get nervous and they don't know what to do, and time pressure is sinking in. So what do? They just trade, right? That's the knee-jerk response. I'm just going to trade down, but they don't look at the position afterwards. And that's a mistake we all made. I made it in that game I just mentioned to you with the queens in the ending. So that's something to think about there. So just to kind of wrap this up, when it's your turn to move, you want to first look at your opponent's threats. You have to say, what is the threat? Because it's your turn to move. That means he or she just moved before you. So he just moved. You have to look at the threats. You have to look at their immediate threats, if they're going to win material, and also their long-term plans. You have to assess that first. Assuming that's dealt with and there's not an issue, then you look at tactics. Short-range moves where they can win a pawn, where you can, win a pawn or win material. Again, if you win more than a pawn, that's usually decisive, but be very careful about pawn grabbing, because what happens is, for example, if your queen goes deep into your opponent's territory, your opponent, is going to then develop his pieces while attacking your queen, and then you have to say, is it worth it? Is his lead and development worth it over a pawn? You kind of have to weigh that and look at the bigger picture. All right. After you look at tactics, assuming there were none there, which is probably true for most positions, you then have to look at your positional ideas and your plans. This is what most of your moves are going to be. All right. Look at your long-term plans, your opponent's long-term plans. Can you control a square more? Can you create weak pawns? Do you have pawn levers that might cause weaknesses in his position? All these different things. Can you improve the position of your pieces? Can you stop his pieces from getting good squares? Can you stop counterplay? All right. And again, the two bishops myth, I told you how I feel about that. I think that's a little bit overrated. The idea that having two bishops is better than having a bishop and a knight or two knights, I think that's overrated, but that's just me. And then the very last thing you need to do is a blunder check. So you've worked out your intended move. Is it a mistake? Okay, it might be good positionally because it helps control a square, but if it's going to hang your bishop or something like that, then you can't play it. And you have to really question yourself, try to poke holes in it, and be cynical. All right. And you have to look far enough ahead. Now, this may seem like a lot to take in, and you may say, well, look, if I'm playing a blitz game, how is this going to help? I'm really speaking about playing over the board chess in live tournaments with like a typical club control of like game 90 or game 60. Now, for a 5-minute blitz game online, believe it or not, you can still use this process. You just have to do it real fast. But you can do that. But again, this is more for traditional time controls. But even when I play a 5-minute game online, I'm still kind of going through this process, just obviously quickly and not quite as thoroughly. I mean, if it's a 5-minute game, you got to move. But even in speed chess, there is a thought process like this that takes place, just not as thorough. All right. And of all these four things, the most important ones, I believe the ones where people make the most mistakes are actually 1 and 4. In other words, the very first thing, what is the threat? I think players at the amateur level don't think that through enough when it's their turn to move. And then the blunder check at the end. Those are the two most important things. You really have to be aware of your opponent's ideas. But anyway, this is the thought process, that I use, that I teach to others. And again, I'm not making any of this stuff up. this has all been out there, but I'm just kind of giving my own take on it. As always, I appreciate you listening, and I hope you win your next game. Have a great day.